How are we? Good? Good. I need to just clear the air really quick, and here's the deal for today. I have a little bit of an apology. Last night, I started coughing incessantly and am unable to talk longer than about 10 minutes before I've kind of gone into coughing. And so I just want to let you know ahead of time so that you're not sitting there just being like, oh my goodness. And I also just want to say we're going to get through this, and it's going to be a great Sunday. So with that, if you would pray with me, that would be fantastic. Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you, Lord, and we just lift up this morning. And God, I pray above all, Lord, that you would just be made beautiful in this place. And I pray that whether I'm coughing or whether our minds are wandering, that there would just be no level of distraction that could compete with who you are. And I pray that you make that known. Be with us, be with me. Teach us more about who you are. In Jesus' name, amen. So with that, hopefully that's the last time. I have a weird declaration to make. Another one, apparently, and it's this. I hate the car, the 1998 green Buick Park Avenue. I hate it. And if you drive one, I think that's great. Or if you drive a Buick, and so there's some of you that say, you know what, I think it's the greatest car ever. It's the only car I'm ever going to drive. I've loved it. I've never had an issue. Good. And I hope that is true, and I hope that continues. I drove a green 1998 Buick Park Avenue that I firmly believe was forged in a factory of despair and ran not only on gasoline, but on hate and rage, because this car broke all of the time. It just did. Here's an example. 3 months after I buy it, just a short time, my family decides to take a vacation down to Rocky Point, and we start driving down there. As I go to cross the border, the check engine light comes on, and I'm still like, just my 2 front tires have crossed. Instantaneously, the engine temp just starts soaring out of control, and before I can get out of this little corridor and actually pull the car over and turn it off, my engine's seized. Done. The car's done, and that's just, there it is. And I don't know if it's user error or what. I'm just going to blame it on the Park Avenue. But what was even more frustrating about this is they wouldn't let me push it back across the border. So I had to push my car, and it's like 100-some degrees out, back into the U.S. border line. And for 2 hours, I just kind of walked with this car, pushing it across the border. So frustrated by the time I got there. But I decided, you know what, it's a decent vehicle, and maybe it was just a fluke thing. And so I rebuilt the engine. Which is why it was even more disappointing when just a little while later, the transmission went out. Those are like the 2 most expensive things that you can fix on a car. And so I was like, well, we've already sunk some money into this, and now we should rebuild the transmission, because surely nothing else will happen. And surely I was wrong, because the car just kept breaking. It was this little thing or that little thing. In the end, I probably should have just hung on to it. But it began to represent just like frustration in my life, where I said, you know what, I want this car gone. I'm going to sell it. And so I went to sell the vehicle. A gentleman comes over to test drive it. We get in the car. We drive for 50 yards. He wants to buy it. And 50 yards, the car starts to shake, and it breaks down during the test drive. And I remember I held my hands on my face. I said, you have got to be kidding me. And in the end, I basically gave the thing away, more or less. I mean, I sold it, don't get me wrong, but, well, I'm glad it's gone. And it's weird, because in our lives, there's few things that are more frustrating as when our car breaks down. Do you feel like that's true? I mean, it's been true for me, and I don't know why. I just know we all share this same common experience where you get in your car, you take your keys out of your pocket, your purse, wherever that is, and you put them in the ignition, and you go to turn that thing, and it's like you have some contractual agreement, some basic understanding. I brought this, I filled you up, you owe me. Drive. Like, that's what we do. And you just sort of take it for granted, which is why there's nothing more frustrating than that moment when you turn the key and nothing happens, right? Your eyes get wide and you go, oh, no. Or you're driving down the road and it starts to shake and lights start to come on your dash, and all of a sudden you are broken down and stuck. And it's not just that it's inconvenient, and it's not just that it's going to cost us some money. Don't get me wrong, that's a little bit frustrating. But what you have to understand, part of the reason why cars breaking down is so frustrating for us is because it messes with 2 things that we as human beings do not like having messed with. We guard these things. These are very important to us. One is certainty, and the other is security. And here's what I mean. When a car breaks down, you had plans. You had places to go. You had a life to live. You had kids to take to this place. You had errands that you needed to run. And suddenly, the life that you thought you were going to live, the life that you desired to live, is on hold. And you don't know when it's going to come back, right? And it messes with certainty and security. And the reason we don't want certainty and security messed with is because they are ultimately guided by an even deeper question. And this is a question that drives us. This is a question that has driven humanity for all of time. And it's this subtle thing that we hate to ask ourselves. And so we cling to certainty and security, but it's this: am I going to be okay? And it maybe sound trivial, but your car breaks down and suddenly you're like, am I going to be okay? Can I live the life that I needed to? Can I accomplish the things I have? And security falls to the ground, and certainty does too, and you're frustrated because we like a guarantee. We'll work countless extra hours and pay thousands more dollars so that we can get a guarantee or a warranty, and it's all just so that we can have the comfort of knowing that if anything were ever to go wrong, we're just fine. We hand them the slip of paper and life is back on track. We'll do crazy things just to know that. We'll spend thousands more dollars on a vehicle that we don't ultimately need, but because every time I put that key in that ignition, it starts, and it's going to, because I said so. Maybe that's why following God is so hard sometimes. Because we live in a world where you don't know what tomorrow holds, right? I mean, you don't know how, next week ends, and you don't know how 2 weeks begin, and you don't know what happens a year from now or 5 years from now. You have ideas, but life, well, we just don't know beyond this instant. And so there's some uncertainty in that. And furthermore, we believe in a God that the average person would decree cannot be seen and is never heard. And we believe in a God who has guided human history throughout time with miraculous events, one of which we're going to gather to celebrate in a week at Easter. And yet natural law keeps telling us that, frankly, that's just not possible. Or you want to make this personal and not just in your head. We believe in a God who promises us hope and love, peace and joy. And yet our lives keep coming in conflict with brokenness and hurt. And it's weird because we have answers for why all these things happen, and you formulate your own little, response so that you can have certainty and security. But when your life gets messed with, when your heart gets kind of, tugged around more or less, what happens is you start to ask that still small question that exists within the hearts of every human being. And it's this: am I going to be okay? How do I know? It's a driving question. And so in terms of where we're going this morning, I want that question to frame out how you see the rest of this talk. And two, here's my hope for you. I hope that today, and I pray this, I hope that today, that you would encounter, or perhaps even re-encounter, a God who does not merely provide the answer to the question, am I going to be okay, but who ultimately is the answer to the question. And taking it even a step further, I hope and I pray that you find the courage to let go of what I'm going to call some of our own homemade guarantees, and that you would find yourself able to cling to a God who is simply uncontainable. And so, we're in this Jesus Is series, and it's somewhat with irony that right now, as we get ready to open the Bible, I'm going to ask you to turn to Exodus, because I need to talk about Moses for a little bit. And so you can turn to Exodus chapter 3, but hang out, because I don't want to take for granted that everyone in here just knows the story. If you do, follow along. Here's the deal. There was a man named Moses. And at the time that Moses lived, the most powerful nation in the known world was Egypt, and the most powerful ruler existed within that nation, and he was the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh owned, and that's the correct word to use, he owned somewhere in the neighborhood of about 1 million Hebrew slaves. They were his possessions. They constituted the workforce of Egypt. And so they did what Pharaoh asked. In fact, they were lesser class citizens, if they were even citizens at all. There was racism and stuff that occurred within this. They were mistreated. They were kind of abused. They were taken for granted. They were considered to be less than. And this just played out in society. Well, there was one Hebrew who did not share in that collective experience with his people. His name was Moses. And by a set of miraculous events, which is another sermon and another time, Moses is adopted into the royal household. He's adopted into the household of Pharaoh, where he is raised up. This is where Moses grows up. And so I want you to imagine being Moses, where your experience is that you are a Hebrew, and yet you're raised in the royal household. But every time you set foot outside of this place, you see the people that you ultimately know you belong to, and they're mistreated and they're abused, and there's something within you that says, I am one of them, but I'm not, and you have this conflict that exists within you. I mean, you could feel this. Which is why at one point in time it comes to a head. Moses sees this Egyptian official, this Egyptian slave master, more or less, who is abusing a Hebrew slave. He's beating him. And Moses, I don't know if maybe he just snapped. I don't know if all of this was the culmination of his existence and his experience so far, but Moses interferes. He jumps in the middle of it, and with such passion that he ends up killing the Egyptian. I don't know if that was a part of the plan or he just lost control. And this moment is unchangeable in his life, and here's why. Here's why. Because you cannot be a Hebrew in Pharaoh's household and kill an Egyptian in order to protect a Hebrew slave. One, that violates a hierarchy that was established. It violates a lot of principles. But two, when you are oppressing people, one of the key things to this that we see throughout history is if there is a group of people who are oppressed, you cannot give them a sense of hope, because hope is empowering. And so Moses, who kills this Egyptian official, what happens if suddenly the people decide, you know what? What if we all rise up against our masters? What if when we're mistreated, we do have the option to overthrow them? You incite rebellion, you cause chaos. Pharaoh has to stamp this out if he's going to continue to enslave and oppress these people. And so he does. Pharaoh gets angry and he decrees that Moses is going to be killed. And so Moses runs. He has to flee the land. And so now this man who is torn between two households has no home. And he goes wandering through the desert, not knowing where his end destination is, only knowing he has to escape where he's been. And he journeys through there, and miraculously, I guess he lives. He makes it. He comes across a group of people called the Midianites. They were nomadic shepherds. And they take him in, and he marries one of their daughters, and he starts a family. And you get this sense that Moses finally is going to have some security, some certainty. Moses has finally left Egypt far enough in the background and finally established a new life for himself close enough right here that he can start moving on, which is why it's kind of sad that one day he is tending his flock and he goes around the mountain. He's at a place called Mount Horeb, and he sees a bush and it's on fire. It's burning, but it's not being consumed. And Moses does what I would do. Let's go check that out, because that'd be amazing, right? You'd want to go see what this thing is. That's fantastic. And so he climbs up this mountain and he goes and stands, before this bush. And the bush speaks to Moses, and it tells him essentially that he is God, that he's come in contact with the very presence of the God of the universe. And this is arguably the very first time that Moses encounters God. And this God is making himself known. And it's this powerful thing, so much so that he says, you know what, you're standing on holy ground, take off your shoes, for you're in God's presence. And also, in addition to that, whenever Moses tried to speak, when Moses goes to actually talk back to this God, he has to hide his face. That presence is so powerful, it is so incredible, it is so overwhelming that Moses can't even bring himself to look upon it. And so with shoes off and face hidden, he finds himself before the God of the universe. Thank you. And this is where we find our passage today, Exodus chapter 3, starting at verse 10. Excuse me. God says to Moses, "Come, I will send you to Pharaoh that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt." Now think about that. Moses, who's hiding his face, basically in awe of this God, suddenly hears this voice that tells him, "Come, you're going to go before Pharaoh, and essentially you're going to liberate my people." I wonder if he laughed. And you know what, maybe I'm probably just going to say he didn't, because that presence would have been so incredible that the thought of laughter wouldn't even come in there. But I wonder if he started to sweat, and I wonder if his eyes got wide, and I wonder if he swallowed deep, because do you realize what God just asked Moses to do? It's the equivalent of Moses escaping from prison with his life. He's got a death sentence. He escapes from prison. He finally finds safety. And now it's as though God's asking Moses, I want you to turn and I want you to walk straight back to that prison. I want you to find an audience with the warden. And then I want you to let him know that you're taking the captives with you. This doesn't bode well. It's a suicide mission. It's crazy. We'd all look at this and be like, there is no way, which is why Moses responds the way that he does. Verse 11, but Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt?" Can't tell you how many times we read this passage and people go, "Oh, humble Moses. Oh, who am I, God, that I should do this?" No, think about who Moses is and what God's asking him. Who am I that I should do this? Paraphrase, are you crazy? Are you out of your mind? And you'd never say that. This is a sovereign, holy, sacred moment. This is a big deal. You wouldn't say that. And so what does Moses say? "Oh, who am I, God, that you would ask me to do this?" There's got to be 100 other people who Pharaoh, the most powerful man in the region, does not want to kill. Why would you march me back to his doorstep to essentially ask a question that almost got me killed in the first place? Are you crazy? And God says to him, God said, but I will be with you. And this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. And when you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Now, if I'm Moses, I feel a little better because I'm standing before this powerful deity who I can't even bring myself to look upon. I can't. And I am just awestruck by who he is, and I can sense his power, and I can sense his presence, and I know that all that's true, and so I have a little bit of comfort here because he says he will be with me. And that's good, but you need to understand from Moses' perspective, I mean, he grew up in Egypt. There's a God for this and a God for that. And so, yeah, that's great that this God is powerful, that this God is, amazing and intense, but how do I know? And then the sign that God gives Moses is really kind of, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but it almost seems kind of weak. If you're in Moses' shoes, here's what I mean. If you're standing in a spot and somebody's asking you to go before the most powerful man on a suicide mission, and you say, I'd love some security, I'd love some certainty, who am I that you should ask me to do this? And then the sign that you're going to get is, when all is said and done, when everything's over, you're going to be back here on this mountain and you're going to be serving me. You go, good, but no offense, when I get done with all of this and I'm back here on this mountain, I know that it all worked out fine because that's what happened. But what about right now? But what about right here? What do I do with this? Do you realize what you're asking me? And this is why Moses keeps talking. Then Moses said to God, if I come to the people of Israel and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Now we think when Moses talks here that he's just accepted this and that he's at this spot where, okay, now just how do I reference you, God? Because that's how we treat names. Names are a reference by which, we refer to one another. What you need to understand about Hebrew culture is a name was defining. The name that you were given defined who you were. This is why it's so significant in the Bible in various instances where God encounters somebody and he changes their name because he's making a declaration with this name that you were this way, but now you are this way. Everything has changed. God is making himself evident. That's how this is. Like he is changing who they are. And so Moses goes to him and says, look, what name shall I take? I'm going to go before these people. I'm going to go before Pharaoh. What name can I take with me? And it's not just information. He's not just saying, hey, can I have a point of reference? What he's saying is, could you define yourself? Could you give me a name so that when I take that long walk back to Egypt, I can just say over and over in my head, this is crazy, but it's okay because this God is with me and he's the God of, he's a warrior. He's the God of justice, whatever that thing is, and he's going to come through for me. So what's your name? And it's that desire. You see, he's in the spot where he's craving certainty and security, and he's asking that deep question that so often so many of us ask, and it's this: am I going to be okay? Is this going to work out? Could you give me something to grab a hold of? What's your name? Which is what makes God's answer so profoundly beautiful. Verse 14, God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say this to the people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. And you see what's significant is Moses asked for something concrete. Moses wanted something concrete, this name. Tell me who you are. Confine yourself to this name so that I can hold this thing and I can have comfort and I can have security so that I can answer the question, am I going to be okay? Because that's just what drives us. And God essentially says, here's who I am. If you want to know something about me, you asked for a name. But I am the God who cannot be limited by a name. I am a God who is not defined by a name, and I am not bound within it. In fact, I simply am. I was, I will be, I am. And he declares in this phrase that there are no other gods, that these Egyptian gods that you're probably comparing me to, they don't matter and they don't exist, for I simply am. I am all there is. I am all there ever will be, and I am here with you right now, which is why when I told you, but I will be with you, that it is enough. And what's really significant here is Moses, who asked for something concrete that he could wrap his mind around, his hands around, that he could tangibly hold on to, isn't given that. And instead, God says, I am. And what Moses is forced to cling to is God himself. It's powerful. And Moses walks back to Egypt, and he goes before Pharaoh. He liberates the people. They journey out into the wilderness, the desert, just like God said they would. And I Am comes through. And eventually, God does this really amazing thing. God does this really amazing thing. And it's this. I think he understands our need for certainty and security. I think he understands that so many of us are plagued by the question, am I going to be okay? And so God gives them certainty, and he gives them security, and it's called the Jewish law. And it's complete and it's exhaustive. And so when people are saying ultimately, because what we're saying with our lives is, how do I know I'm okay with God? How do I know that in the end all this works out? How do I know that I'm on the right path? Can you give me something to hold on to? And God says, sure, follow these things. Here is my law. It's complete and it's exhaustive. There you go. And we know that the story of the rest of the Old Testament is they embrace that law and they just love the notion of security and certainty and following it, but then they're imperfect people just like you and myself, and they mess that deal up. They forget all about it. They walk away. And then they're reminded of the law, and then they walk away from it again. And then they're reminded of the law, and eventually you get to, further down the road, a day where it's kind of implemented, it's cemented. And what happened was, every time that they would forget and they'd remember, they do what we do, where we say, you know what, I'm so glad my life has changed. If you ever have a moment like this where you kind of turn something around in your life, no matter how small or how big, and you go, I don't want to go back. And then you slip back into that, maybe. And then you move forward again and you say, you know what, I don't want to go back. And so instead of just abiding by the one rule you had in the first place, you create rules that make sure that you obey the rules, that make sure that you obey that rule, and laws have laws after them and rules have rules, and it's exhaustive. And so by the time you get to Jesus' day, you arguably have the most complete system of religion over the course of human history. And I'd argue that even today, Judaism, Orthodox Judaism, is the most complete system of religion ever. Here's an example of how this is kind of played out, a modern day one. You see, when God gave them the law, he said, okay, everyone must take a Sabbath day of rest, all together. And on that one day, you shall not kindle a fire within your dwellings. That's what God said. Shall not kindle a fire within your dwellings. Well, people started to ask questions about that. Well, okay, what constitutes a fire or not? You know how we are. Like when you were a little kid, you'd have that weird semantic argument that never plays out well for anyone, just involves being grounded or finding yard work. And so this is, well, let's make a rule about that. So then it became, you couldn't make a fire, period. There's just no fire that you could make. Well, and then eventually now it's, well, what constitutes a fire? And so in modern day, especially in urban areas, it has been a historic tradition that Orthodox Jewish synagogues should be made without parking lots. You say, well, why? Because you can't drive there on the Sabbath. Because when you get in your car and you turn a key, you fire a spark plug, which starts a fire, which creates combustion. And that is work, and you cannot do that on the Sabbath. And what I'm trying to illustrate here is laws had laws, and rules had rules, and it's just like ironed out to the nth degree, to the point where it becomes the most exhaustive, complete system of religion in the history of mankind. And this thing that could have been looked at as a beautiful accomplishment ends up becoming an utter tragedy. And here's why. Because the people began to cling so tightly to this religion that they stopped clinging to God. They began to cling so tightly to these laws that they followed, to attendance on the synagogue, to their times of prayer, to their Bible studies, to everything else that they did that constituted this religious makeup that assured them that at the end of the day they could have certainty and they could have security that they were going to be okay, this deep question within them. They clung to this so much that it became like a container that they held in their hands, and they held that so tightly that they stopped holding on to the God of the universe, and they held this and they missed I Am. And so as we move into our passage today with Jesus, Glenn has been talking about this Feast of Tabernacles, this Feast of Booths over the last 2 weeks that occurred, where Jesus makes these bold declarations of hope and promise and says some pretty amazing things. And people want to follow him. They start to say, this guy might actually know what he's talking about. He might actually be the Messiah. We want to follow you. And so Jesus starts to address them. He gets an audience. If you want to, you can turn to John chapter 8. We'll be there in just a second. He gets an audience, and they start to have this conversation. In John chapter 8, verse 31 through 32, Jesus says to the Jews who believed in him, if you abide in my word, then you will know that you are my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free. I hear this. This is another like bold proclamation, this beautiful thing of hope, right? If I hear this, what I think in my head is, that's amazing. He's offering me freedom. Because if I'm ever really honest, there are times in my life where I feel like I'm just not free. There are times in my life with the stuff that we walk through, the things we experience, where even within ourselves, where we feel bound. And that notion of freedom is powerful and it's beautiful. And I think people should have just stood up and said, yes, you're God, you're amazing. But here's their reaction. Instead, they cringe. And they essentially look Jesus in the eye and they say, how dare you? How dare you? Because what you have to understand is Jesus says, if you abide in my word, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. And the reverse implications of that is that you are not, in fact, free right now. You're a slave. This is what he says to these people who follow their religious custom to the T, who clutch this thing with all of their certainty and all of their security because it avoids the having to ask that deep question that no one wants to ask. And they can't handle it. Because what Jesus is saying is, you are a slave to sin. And they say, we've never been a slave to anybody. We're children of Abraham. We're not slaves. How dare you? And Jesus says, but you are. But you are. And it's just like us. If we're honest, we know that no matter how good our life gets, no matter how honestly we try to be a great person, no matter how much we embrace morality, no matter how much church attendance we have, no matter how much we read our Bibles, no matter how much of the day we spend praying, that at the end of the day, there's a part of us within ourselves that just desires something other than that which God has for us. There's a part of us that's broken, and we feel this. You sense it. You know. And he says, you're actually still a slave to sin, and they can't grapple with it. And here is why. If they crave certainty and if they crave security, then they're clutching their religious system, their rules, their laws, their attendance, their morality. They're clutching it here super tight. And if ultimately this is what they're putting their hope in, then if this stuff is all true, then they have sin dealt with. They can answer, I'm okay, because look, it's right here. And Jesus says, no, you're a slave to sin. And if they embrace that to be truth, what it means is that this thing isn't enough. This thing isn't working. This thing that I've kind of held on to is not going to take me to the place that I need to go. And suddenly security crashes, and suddenly certainty crashes, and suddenly they're forced to ask that still small question that every one of us avoids, am I going to be okay? And that is one of the most terrifying moments in the human existence. Most of you know. Because you come to the end of yourself. You come to the end of that which secures you, that which makes you certain. And so here's what they do. They look to Jesus and they say, how dare you? You know what? You're a Pharisee. And what they meant by that was, it's a racial slur in the way that they used it. They basically said, you're incapable of knowing God. And you're a lesser class human being. And not only that, you're demon possessed. Think about this. Think about the audacity of that moment. That they would stand before the God of the universe, the Son of God himself, and cling so tightly to this that they could be confronted with Jesus Christ himself. And what they ultimately say to him is not only I have questions, not I have doubts, or hey, I need to sort through this. How dare you? You're demon possessed. They would accuse him of being the enemy. Why? Because we'll protect this at all costs. We will not let this thing fall. We will hold it in our hands. We will clutch it until our fingers go white, because you can't let go of certainty and security, because that question that guides it is terrifying. And so if you would, let's read the rest of this kind of conflict. John chapter 8, we're going to start at verse 51. Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death. Another beautiful, bold proclamation. And the Jews said to Abraham, now we know that you have a demon. Or the Jews said to him, now we know that you have a demon. Abraham died, as did the prophets, yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets died, meaning all the patriarchs, the very people that we built our society, our religion, our culture, all of this stuff that we hold in the palm of our hands, the very people that we built this thing on, are you in fact greater than them? And then they say, tell us who you are. Let us know tell us who you actually are. Give an account for yourself. And they say, who do you make yourself out to be? And in verse 54, Jesus answered, if I glorify myself, my glory is nothing. For it is my Father who glorifies me, of whom you say he is our God, but you have not known him. Can we pause for a second? Because I don't want you to miss something that just occurred here. Jesus is talking to people who have devoted their lives towards knowing Scripture, towards attending the synagogue, towards discovering the God of the universe. They have read the Old Testament. Many of them have it like memorized almost. They have lived morally. They have lived rightly. They have done everything they need to do. They go to Bible studies. They attend worship services. Their whole life is this giant religious experience. And what does Jesus say to them? He says, but you do not know God. And what is remarkable about this, I know a lot of us are tempted to just look at them and be like, well, yeah, how dare they? They have missed the point. But what we should understand is that it is actually possible, even now, to get so caught up in Christianity that you miss Jesus. It is possible to get so caught up in following the ways of God that you let go of God himself, because those ways in your mind suddenly become enough. And Jesus says, but you do not know him. That baffles my mind. He says, but I know him. And if I were to say that I do not know him, I would be a liar like you, but I do know him and I keep his word. Your father Abraham rejoiced that he would see my day. He saw it and was glad. And so the Jews said to him, continuing to argue, you are not 50 years old. And how have you seen Abraham? And the reason they say 50 years old is it was a point in life in their culture where you hit kind of like a wisdom roll in who you were within society. And they're saying, you haven't even crossed this threshold yet, much less how could you have ever known or seen Abraham? And Jesus said to them, and before I read this next line, I want all that we have talked about with Moses and all that he experienced to suddenly flood back into your heads as you hear Jesus' response. But Jesus said to them, truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am. Jesus says, I'm God, more or less. And he ultimately is asserting, I don't fit in your container. That I'm not bound to stay within this little thing that you're holding on to right now. For I am. And he declares, this man in human form, the Son of God declares, I was and I will be and I am right now. I am all there is. Like I am God, and that's what he's essentially saying. And you have this, if we could stand like a third party kind of viewing this experience, and you have the crowd and you have Jesus right there, would it not baffle you when Jesus declares, I am God? And you would think that these people would suddenly be like, oh my goodness, we've missed it. But no, instead, even in the most honest sense of truth, even in the most honest moment of confrontation, and I don't mean in a negative way, I just mean Jesus physically present standing there, they would cling so tightly to this that they would dismiss him altogether. The next line says that they got so mad that they picked up stones and decided to kill him, and Jesus just disappears quietly. That they would end him over this. It's possible to get so caught up in following the ways of God that you actually miss God himself. Let me illustrate a story. I illustrate this kind of with a story. When I was in high school at the mature age of 15 years old, I had a chemistry class. And in this chemistry class, we did an experiment one day, and we took a tiny little jar and we put 0.1 grams of iodine tablets and 0.1 grams of zinc powder, and you shook it all up in there and you added a droplet of water underneath a hood vent, and it made purple iodine gas. And the hood vent sucked it up, and I looked at that and I said, that would be awesome in the cafeteria. And so I took 0.1 grams of each substance, and I took a dropper of water, and I took these things out of the chemistry lab, and I walked into the cafeteria, and I set these on the middle of a table, and like 600 people eat in this cafeteria. And all of my friends sit down, and I go, guys, we did this chemistry experiment. I'm going to make some purple smoke. It's going to be like a smoke bomb. Nobody freak out, right? Famous last words. Nobody move. And so I go and I add a droplet of water to this, and it fizzes and purple smoke comes out, and it just dissipates into a giant room, and nobody notices. And all my friends cross their arms and they look at me and they go, that was stupid. That was lame. Which I should have taken as, well, that was really a poor idea. I should not have done that. Instead, I took it as go big or go home. The next day, instead of 0.1 grams of each substance, I took 50 grams of each substance. Oh, good. And instead of taking a droplet of water, I filled up a Sunny Delight container with water, and I walk into the cafeteria and I set this big jar down in the middle of the table, and I tell my friends, today is going to be a little bit bigger. And I say, I don't want anybody to move, and I don't want anyone to freak out because I don't want to get in trouble, because that's going to happen. And so I take this thing and I go 1, 2, 3, and I dump out all of the, this container of water onto this thing, and as soon as the water hits it, it sounds like a jet engine is taking off. It is bubbling with such like intensity and ferocity that all you hear is over in this corner, and I turn around because I'm immediately like, oh no, and I go to walk away. And I turn around and I look, and it looks like a purple Mount St. Helens is blowing up on the middle of the table, and it's filling the room with this purple smoke, which really was a gas. And so you didn't see smoke. It just looked like everyone had purple lenses on. And I didn't know that it was poisonous. And so suddenly, this turns into an emergency, and suddenly there's a mass evacuation. And the story, I'm not going to get into how it ends, but it ends with policemen, fire department, and hazardous chemicals, and a bad time for me. And so, yeah, you're like, why is he sharing this with me? Here's why. Because I was reflecting on this last week. It occurred to me that experiment, that failed thing inside of the cafeteria, relates so well to what we're talking about here. And here's what I mean by this. The way most of us tend to treat God is like I did on that first day. We take a little of this and a little of that, and he's this nice, convenient, easy little experiment. You put some worship in there, and you put some church attendance, and you have some Bible study, and maybe even memorize some things, and some moral living, and some different stuff. You put it all in there in this nice little container, and then we take a dropper of what we hope is God, what we believe to be God, and we drop him in there, and it makes a little pfft. And then we hold this thing in our hands and we say, see? And you show it to your friends like, isn't this worth changing your life around? But the truth of the matter is that it's become our own neat little convenient way of giving ourselves reassurance that we can have certainty and that we can have security so that we never have to ask the question, am I going to be okay? And so we just add another drop of water to our kind of convenient Christian life that we live, and we put it in there and we hold the thing up, and no one's convinced by this. Is it any wonder that Tucson, in recent study, the last thing I read, was labeled one of the top 20 most unchristian cities in our nation? That 39% of Tucsonans have not even attended a church service in the last 6 months? It's because it's not compelling. It's just not. And the truth of the matter is if we were ever to grab a hold of he who is the great I am and add him to this little experiment that we call the Christian life and really go for it and really do this, what would happen is he would spill over the top. He could not be contained within that thing. He would fill every square inch of our known existence that we call life with himself because he's bigger than that. He was, he will be, he is, I am. And he's not content to just be contained here. And he's not content to allow us to just grab a hold of our security and our certainty and to cling to those things, because he showed up in human form and he beckoned you and he beckoned me that ultimately at the end of the day we might just grab a hold of Jesus himself, because he can't be contained, because he's too big for your experiment, because he wants to take you somewhere. If you look at Isaiah, I love it. When Isaiah has this vision of the throne room of God, he glimpses just a piece of God's glory. And his response in this is he just says, woe to me, for I am ruined. I am a man of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the glory of God. And a good paraphrase for that is this moment changes everything. So why doesn't God? Don't get so caught up in following the ways of God that you forget what it is to grab a hold of God himself. Because he cannot be contained within this tiny existence. He's too big. He is the great I am. So what I want to do right now in closing is I just want to invite you to the same things that Jesus did over the course of John chapter 7 and 8 on this feast. So I just want to say to those of you who know what it is to thirst, to those of you who are thirsty deep within your soul and you're looking and searching, I want to invite you to encounter the great I am, who will become living water, who will quench and satisfy your thirst. But you need to be ready, because it's not content to stay there. It's too big to hold right here, because what does Jesus say? And then streams of living water will flow from you into the rest of this world. And I want to invite you to encounter the great I am, who is the light of life and the light of men. For those of you that know what it is to walk in darkness, and who sometimes feel like life is a fog, I want to invite you to experience this light, but you need to be ready. And here's what I mean when I say that. Once you gaze into that light, it's too big to be just contained within you. It will reflect in you, it will fill you, and you will reflect it back out. You will not have a choice. God's too big. It's got to change you, and it's going to change people around you. And lastly, if you yearn for what it is to be set free, to experience true freedom, I just want to say, find the courage to let go of whatever this thing is that you might fully embrace the God of the universe, the great I am, and that he would not only change you, but that we would see this world ultimately changed around us. Let's sing.